Thank you guys for coming out to our less used venue, but now we'll probably be seeing you here more often in 2013. As many of you know, the Cowl in Fort Mason and the Herbst are both closed for renovation for the rest of the year. But we are very happy to be here at the Marines Memorial. And as many of you know, we start these talks with what we call a long short, a short film that exemplifies long-term thinking. Tonight's, we also wanted to cross over into computing and mechanical computing. This one kind of is near and dear to my heart as a designer and builder of a 10,000-year mechanical clock that has astronomical dials. My heart is warmed by the fact that it might be found at the bottom of the ocean, and that 2,000 years later, someone might take X-rays of it and put it back together and know what the heck we were trying to do. This one happens to have been a recreation of the Antikythera device in Lego.
Good evening. I'm Stewart Brand from the Long Now Foundation. I wonder if they could make that 500 feet high inside a mountain. And in fact, can we make a 10,000-year Long Now clock out of Legos? There's a whole marketing process that could happen there. I'm wearing a jacket. In honor of our speaker, Negroponte, is from the East Coast, where they wear jackets. And when I arrived a little late, he was here. He had no jacket. He had left his jacket in the green room in honor of the West Coast, which doesn't wear jackets. So we'll both wear jackets tonight. The peculiar thing about Negroponte, well, one of the peculiar things about Negroponte is that he's total East Coast guy, right down to his toenails. And unlike every other East Coast person, understands the West Coast very well, and probably better than we do. And that's why I wound up working at the Media Lab back in 1987, having seen him at the West Coast in the 1984 first TED conference in Monterey. And if there's a real dynamic East Coast, West Coast that is fruitful instead of the usual argument junk, it's because Nicholas has been that kind of amphibian, among many other kinds of amphibian. He's comfortable with government, he's comfortable with corporations, he's comfortable in the ivory tower, and I think he'll be comfortable up here talking about I'm not sure what. Nicholas Negroponte.
I don't know. I don't consider myself East Coast. I actually don't consider myself anything. I grew up without feeling an ounce of nationalism because I went in different parts of the world, and I actually grew up without thinking that I belonged to a country. And I have 3 passports, and I just have never thought of nationalism as something, or parts of countries. And it may show itself in sort of some of my remarks. Stewart asked me to talk about the very long term, and don't know if I can quite do 10,000 years, Stewart, but I'll try and go beyond some of the things I've been doing recently. And the way I'm going to do it is take a running start and talk a little bit about the past, because I get credit sort of unfairly for so-called predicting the future. And I didn't really predict the future. I extrapolated from what we were doing in the lab, and extrapolation's a lot easier. So when somebody had to read and collect and so on and predict, that's a very different art form, and it's a very different phenomenon. So I got the, sorry, I've got to point this. I've got the pleasure of extrapolating. And so being digital was actually a bit old-fashioned. Some of the people who read it in '95 said, come on, there's nothing new in here. It's what we're already doing. And when I looked back and when I thought forward and listened to Stewart, I tried to find the one thing that sort of characterized everything I'd done and sort of the things I think about, and it really turned out to be this difference between bits and atoms. And I might not have called it that 30, 40 years ago, but it really was about the difference. And most people don't realize that the word bits is very new. It's actually 1948. The word didn't exist before. And it was the concatenation of binary and digit. People didn't really, it wasn't used in the language. And it's not, as I say, particularly old. So when we started at the Media Lab and before the Media Lab to articulate it and to think about it more clearly, I think you will find at the end some pretty startling results when you don't think not just of atoms, but your atoms aren't in your thinking about things. And so I will try to work up to that. I thought I would go back to my very beginning to take a running start from that far back. I was convinced at the age of 17 I would be an artist because I'd won all the art prizes at school, and I had done things always in art, and always drawing and going to museums as a little child on my own, actually. I think I went off to museums at the age of 7 and 8 on my own. But I made a mistake in the sense that I did very well in math too, and got an 800 in my math, whatever it was called, SAT or the achievements, and went to the headmaster. I was always very ballsy about things like that. I went to the headmaster of the school and I said, you know, I got 800 in my math and I love art, and so obviously I should go into architecture because it's where the two meet. And this headmaster of this private school in Connecticut was very smart, and he said something to me that was extraordinary. He said, you know, I like gray suits and I like pinstripe suits, but I hate gray pinstripe suits. And that was so extraordinary that I went to architecture school, and in fact, I did 2 degrees in architecture before I realized that it was the gray pinstripe suit, and that really the mix of the two was computers. And my first job in life is on the screen here. It was sort of doing, so this is 66, by the way, highly influenced by Moshe Safdie's architecture, which had been for the Montreal World's Fair habitat that you probably know. And by the way, just out of pure chance, he's my neighbor now and perhaps my dearest friend. So sort of life comes back in these funny circles. But this was, you know, multi-million-dollar computer driving this display in a room bigger than this theater that to sort of run all this stuff. But it was my first, you know, effort in it. I didn't really think of, you know, the fact that humans can't experience bits and that you have to display them. But these were my training wheels, and literally running around in the computer room, loading a tape, running back. They actually let me use it alone, this giant machine, which is a little bit like being in a machine shop alone. You shouldn't be allowed to do that. But it was probably dangerous. But I remember, because I had whatever 45 minutes or an hour a day of this thing to myself. And so you really ran to get the stuff physically loaded onto things to get the most use out of it. And then I decided I would do something. This was my first step into the art world at a museum in New York, the Jewish Museum. And my so-called piece was, again, habitat influence. These little blocks were being manipulated by a robot. And the theory, God, this was a weak and silly theory, but the theory was that the gerbils would move the blocks with intention. And that what the robot would do is redo the blocks, so you would see this evolving architecture. Extraordinarily silly, but it really was fun. And we anticipated all sorts of problems, but the one I didn't think of was when this mechanical arm came down on a block and there was a gerbil sitting on top. I don't know if you've had gerbils, but when you squeeze them, it goes awfully far. And it didn't kill any gerbils, but you really get a lot of gerbil on each side and almost nothing in between. So we had animal complaints. This was one of our very early projects, and you'll see why I'm trying to take a running start from the past, because this is, this is 72 or something. 71 or somewhere, 71, 73, and it was a pressure sensitive, not just touch sensitive, but pressure sensitive, because your finger, when it touched the screen, there's enough friction that you could introduce forces laterally, so that this person is touching the screen, and the length of the arrow is how hard he's pushing in that direction. It was, I believe, if it wasn't, it was very close to the world's first touch-sensitive display. And people thought that was stupid. They wrote stories about how touch was stupid. And I had these wonderful liners about how fingers are so wonderful you don't have to pick them up. And that was one of my sentences at the time. And I thought, really cool stuff. People said, no, you would dirty the display. And I said, no, you would be, if the display was dirty, you'd be cleaning it. If it was clean, you'd be dirtying it, so there'd be a steady state depending on your finger. We did it early. Again, I still didn't think of turning bits into atoms, but this was now mid-70s, the idea of that you know where things are spatially, and did a lot of early work that I don't want to dwell on, except I found, thinking about this picture of the calculator, again, people wrote things about, only at MIT would there be the arrogance to display a calculator on this, $1 million system, and it'd be on the screen and you'd touch it and so on. How stupid that was. Well, I guess in one context it was stupid. I don't want to spend too much time on this stuff, but there's at least one person in this audience, Mike Neymark, whom I saw earlier out of the corner of my eye, who will remember this project, which was an Aspen movie map. It almost won the Proxmire Award. Are there people in this room that remember the Golden Fleece Award? God, I wanted to win it so badly and never won it. I was nominated 2 or 3 times, apparently, but this was one that almost made it. It almost won the Proxmire Golden Fleece Award because it was using military money to document the streets in all directions, and I thought this was cute. Somebody sent me those pictures. That is 78, our car, and that's the Google one that does it today. I haven't asked Google for royalties, but it goes way back. And then to start having displays and gestures, and this was kind of the beginning of the Media Lab. Now, in parallel with that, and this leads into a story that I think you'll find, if you don't know about it, rather compelling. In 1982, Seymour Papert and I started an experiment that was funded by OPEC at the time. That started as OPEC funding. You may remember there was a man named Sheikh Yamani. He was the bad guy, but he funded us to work in Paris at something that started and then collapsed soon after. But we did get a start in the use of computers in the developing countries for learning. And Seymour, whom I had known already for about 14 years, wrote a lot of very important papers, and I know there are people in this room who knew him. No, I should say knew him because he's alive but not alive, but he does communicate with some people. At any rate, Seymour wrote a paper which was the introduction to Warren McCulloch's book called "You Can't Think About Thinking Unless You Think About Thinking About Something." Now, if that's not a brilliant title, and he was that kind of person. Now, what Seymour taught me very early on, long before the Paris experiment, was the fact that computer programming was a way to think about thinking, and that debugging programs was pretty close approximation to learning about learning. And whether that goes, a lot further is not 100% clear because constructionism has fallen off the table. It has truly, really succumbed to instructionism, where all of these MOOCs and Khan Academy and all of that, the MOOCs are okay, but it's the Khan Academy stuff. Saul is a wonderful person, but it's the most misguided stuff I've seen in a long time, and it's sucking the air out of the room, which is also a rather interesting phenomenon. Winding up a little bit, by chance, I was able, many years later, almost 20 years later, to do some of this work in Cambodia. And the period in between was when my job was the Media Lab, and the main part of my job at the Media Lab was to raise money and to raise as much of it as possible, and did a reasonable job over the period, but in parallel did a few things outside of MIT. One of was right here. I don't know if Louis and his kids are in the audience, but starting Wired magazine with them was one of the highlights of my life. And also a little bit later, working in Cambodia had enormous influence. And what happened with the Cambodian stuff after doing the Media Lab, I sort of said to myself, it's my turn. And about 7 years ago, we brought in a new director to the Media Lab, and I went off and did one laptop per child. And I don't, again, want to spend too much time on that, though it leads to the reason I'm talking today. One laptop per child was a nonprofit. And that is very, very important because there's such an important difference between a market and a mission. And when people talk about investing in something that's going to be profit-making but do good in some way, that's fine, but be a nonprofit. It's a much clearer phenomenon, and it lets you have partners. I'm not trying to show a picture of myself with Kofi Annan, but as much as you can have a partner like that. You can have the UN as a partner. And he turns out, Mary Lou Jepson's in the audience, she will remember this because she was there. She was probably shouldn't have cut you out of the photograph. You were probably the next seat over to the right or left. This was I think I have a picture of yes, I do. This very silly laptop design, but it was very photogenic and it cast all the right metaphors. Now, you don't want to put a crank on the side of a laptop, and Mary Lou can explain to you why. But what was interesting is that when Kofi Annan is on stage, it fills the room with cameras. And I wouldn't be saying this if it wasn't the truth, because I have somebody in the room that was there. But one of the camera people or reporters in the audience yelled out, "Kofi Annan and Nicholas Negroponte, crank your laptops." So we close the laptops, and then we start cranking. And the handle falls off in his hand. These are engineering models. And the handle falls off, and he doesn't blink. He continues moving his hand as if it hadn't fallen off, and holding it with this little silly yellow thing standing in midair. And I don't think anybody knew. And what's extraordinary is most people go, and they would sort of think, what's happened? I broke it or something. No, he was as cool as a cucumber on cranking that thing. So that's you all know this thing, and there it is, some of the pictures. Well, this project got a disproportionate amount of bad press, but about 2 years ago, a very dear friend of mine took the piece that was more sort of laptop-oriented and has been running it. And I asked myself a very specific question, which I'll get to and then get to some of the points quicker. What happens when there are no schools? And the reason that's interesting, at least was interesting to me and still is, but 2 years ago I latched onto it, was that the official number today is 61 million. Children don't go to first grade, basically. And first of all, it's a very interesting, because where does that number come from? Because if a child is 6 and doesn't go to first grade, next year that child is 7. You still count the child, and now there's a new child come into the system. So the child is now 7 who's been counted last year and this year, and then that child becomes 8. Do you still count the child? And so depending where you draw the line, you can get, if you drew the line at 25, you'd get really high numbers. So you back off, and I can find a grade level where you would come out at 60 or 61, but I think the numbers are higher. So let me use, since I love round numbers, let me use 100 million. There are 100 million kids who don't go to school. Most of them don't go to school because there isn't one, not because they're truants or the parents have forced them to work in the field. It's because there really isn't a school, and that means walking distance. That means at least a school you can get to. So if there's a school 10 miles away for primary school, that doesn't help you. And so when we asked that question, we were already working on tablets. we decided could we run an experiment? And the experiment is really very simple. The experiment is the question, can a child learn to read on his or her own? And it's this reason the question was so simple to frame is that there's this cusp where you learn to read and then you read to learn. Now, it's not a peak, it's not a sharp point, but it tends to happen in second or third grade, typically in this country. And that's fine. So there's that cusp. And so if you can get over the cusp, then you are extremely advantaged. And the brain has evolved over, you pick a number, 1 million years. And the period of evolution, we have learned how to talk and other things, talk and walk, where the brain does that quite naturally, but reading is only something like 3,500 years old. So the brain really doesn't do it naturally. So you have to spend some time, quote, learning it. The question is how much of that can be on your own, how much of it, if any, can be more like talking and more like some of these things we do by interacting with the world. And so we started this experiment. We picked two villages in Ethiopia. And we picked Ethiopia because we knew the country. The head of state had been a great fan of one laptop per child. So the minister was a fan, and the governor was a fan, and everybody down the line, it was kind of contagious. And it was easy to work there. And it happens to be proportion in terms of percentage of kids, either the highest or second highest, depending on who you ask, in the world. It's not the highest absolute numbers. That turns out to be Nigeria. But Ethiopia, in terms of Ethiopia and Afghanistan, compete with each other to have the highest percentage of kids who are illiterate and don't go to school. So it was a reasonable place to work. And what we did is we loaded the tablets with very mediocre material. I don't want for a moment for anybody to think that this is beautifully crafted software that quote teaches you anything. It's just there's just lots of it. There are 400 apps on this tablet, and the apps are in 4 categories. They're games that are conspicuously letter games and phonemes. They're movies that are kids' movies, subtitled almost always. And this, by the way, is all English. So the kids have to learn a language that isn't spoken as well as reading and writing it. And then there are cartoons and there are books, lots of books. So these were dropped off in the village without any instructions, with no humans. A solar panel was delivered the day before, and one adult was shown how to sort of run it. Now, I've been known to say that they hadn't seen words in the village. We discovered that's not 100% true. There's some labels on kids' clothing, and recently there might have been some bottles with labels on them, but basically none of the adults are literate. The children have certainly not seen words and books and magazines. So we dropped these off, and the tablets are hot in the sense that they record everything the kids do, and once a week, the locals who are working with us go into the village and swap SIM cards, basically, put in a new SIM card and take out the old one, because the old one has been recording every touch, photographing, listening, recording, all of it, IRB approved and cleared, for those of you who are concerned about that sort of thing. What's important, at least was important to me in the beginning, was that in 2.5 minutes, the first kid figured out, A, there was something in the box, and B, there was an on-off switch, and that turned on the switch. And apparently, when the kid did it, he sort of yelled out, "I am the lion." And that's and he was apparently the physically, I won't say physically disabled, but was really a very, not the fastest and most active and the most forward kid in the village at all. In fact, so much so, at one point they thought of not even counting him in the counts because they're trying to leave as many tablets as there were kids in the village. So 2.5 minutes to turn it on. Within 5 days, they were using 50 apps per child per day. And within 2 weeks, they were singing ABC songs. And within 5 months, they hacked Android. Now people, there have been people who say, well, what does he mean hacked Android? Did the kids go into some utility and flip a switch? No, they didn't. They actually hacked Android because our team, rightly or wrongly, had disabled the camera because we wanted to sort of use it to take pictures. We didn't want it to be used. Probably, or definitely a mistake. And the kids found a way to hack around that. And it's a little bit more than turning on a switch. The degree to which it's generating code is, or they had to actually type some things is, people can fuss over that, but there really was some major effort. I couldn't do it. I don't know if that's... Now, let me just say one last thing about this and then go on to the extrapolation part. This is perhaps the best image I have, and the kid on the right, it's not 100% clear what he's doing, whether he's bored or whether he's actually running the class. But what interests me more are the 5 kids in between, because if you look at the kid on your left, is using the other kid's tablet, and the other kid's using the other kid's tablet, and talk about collaboration. And all 5 are running different apps, which is pretty interesting as well. With 1 laptop per child, we always went through schools, or almost always went through schools, and the teacher would say, well, now we're all going to do this, and sort of there was a synchronous sort of use that certainly was not happening in this village. Now, we made a mistake. I made a mistake, and that was as I named the villages in a paper. I gave out the name, I said this village and that village, not even thinking what would happen. And now the kids in those villages give press conferences. And this is a press conference. This kid is showing a reporter that she can write words and so on and so forth. So it's been, to say the least, contaminated. But in the past month, the person who is part of the team, somebody named Marianne Wolf, who's at Tufts University and really is one of the world's authority on how the brain learns to read, went to the village and has come back, just startled, because the kids are doing what she calls, cautiously, but she still calls it nonetheless, the precursors of reading, because they're sight words and they can pronounce things out, and they were given tests and they could sound out words that they didn't know, and that was pretty impressive. So on the force of that, my life changed about a month ago in the sense that I'm now chairing the X Prize, where the prize went up last week. It's now $15 million to basically reenact this and do it at scale and do the technology that would be much more serious than what we did, which was scramble together applications. So that's what we're doing, and now how do we go forward, and what are some of the things that, at least the short, long now. And as I tried to think of it, and may or may not come to things that you haven't thought of, this one you have, and that is that the world of silicon and biology, and whether it's the synthetic and the natural, have been so, we always think of them as different. Things are inanimate and animate, and so I think what the future holds, and it's probably, you won't have to go that far out. I mean, 100 years will be actually a long time. It'll be sooner than that, is that there will be no difference anymore. There'll be no difference between the synthetic and the natural and the silicon and the biology. They will all just come together. It won't be a fried egg, it'll be an omelet. And the fried egg nature of the world, which is the world our parents knew, which had crisp edges around things that were yellow and white, by metaphor at least, will no longer be that way. And it's happening in a variety, in lots of different ways, actually. And I used, I want to bring a few examples because I was recently introduced to a couple of concepts that blew me away. I had not thought of the fact that, this is an existing company called, by the way, it's called Modern Meadow. I think it's Modern Meadow or Modern Meadows. And they actually are printing meat. And they're printing the tissue so that you really basically walk off with a hamburger or a steak. And I thought, wow, that's pretty interesting. If you can print meat, you can print creatures. God, that starts to all this stuff where we're kind of looking at printing physical objects, and we think it's 3D printing is so advanced, but my God, if we start eating the stuff we print and it walks off the page after it's been printed, that's pretty different. And the meat one was so convincing because it uses only 1% of the water and 0.5% of the land, and to make it, which is kind of nice, but also you don't have to print the parts that you're not going to eat. You only have to print, the fillet, if that's what you're interested in. You don't need to print the hooves and the ears, and some people like pig ears, and maybe you make glue out of other things, but now you can just print the pieces you want. And I thought that's pretty incredible. And I started to think about those things and thought, wow, this is really a new bits and atoms story. This isn't transmitting a 3D object and making it. It's starting to transmit things that I thought of as natural or coming from the environment. So that I think, tiptoes onto the world of, a very seriously different world of the future. So I then said, and this is where I'm getting close to the punchline, is what does Adam's thinking, lead you to? Now, newspapers, that's obvious, but most people don't pay attention to the fact that newspaper has the word paper in it. And there are only apparently 2 languages that do that. Now, if somebody can think of others, that'd be great, but the English and apparently Chinese does it too, uses the icon for paper in the word newspaper. So that's easy. Telecom pricing is less obvious, but it took me a little bit of time to figure out that the energy required to move something is such that if it's heavier and you're going a longer distance, you're going to charge more. Okay, that's simple. And so if you're going to mail a feather, or you're a long distance, or carry an anvil a short distance, it might cost the same. And that you could build your entire model around that, which is what the phone company did. If you called a long distance, you paid more, and if you shipping lots of bits, you would pay more, which really comes from the world of atoms. And it turns out that the number of bits that you transmit is almost inconsequential to the meaning or the time you spend with it. A book, for those of you who have written them and those of you who read them, a normal novel is 1 million bits. Sorry, it's 1 million bytes. sorry, off by 8, but I caught that one. But it's 1 million bytes. Now, 1 million bytes is not that much. You know, you have a good modern camera with a good sensor. When you click it, you're capturing 1 million bytes. So, and then video, you know, if it's high resolution and you're trying, it's enormous, the number of bits. And one of the things about the internet and the people who were thinking about it early on, and you had told them that Netflix is going to be 35% of the internet bandwidth in this year 2013 on Sunday afternoons, they would have laughed. I mean, but that's actually what it is. And it's because it uses so many bits, and it's very, very bit hungry. So telecom pricing sort of came from the world of atoms, and in some sense the world of, you know, wealth does too. People acquire things, they're kind of physical. There's a lot of atoms thinking. Yes, there's wealth and intellectual wealth and all sorts of other forms, but it is very, very rooted in atoms, especially some of the basic things like drinking water and clothes and, you know, a roof over your head. So that's the sort of some of the obvious ones. Sort of the less obvious ones are the ones that I think are the ones that maybe will be in conversation when Stewart and I talk or in questions you ask. But I think the one that is the serious one, going back to my very first comment, is countries. Countries come from the world of atoms. And I think that nationalism is the biggest disease on the planet. And what do countries come from? Well, they come from something that you can actually walk around the edge. There's a body of water, there's a mountain range, and then it's what's inside, what's outside. And because communications was so poor that you would have all of these languages that would grow up. Sometimes you'd have a language that was totally different on the other side of the mountain, and certainly across bodies of water. Now, the problem with countries is they're too big, usually, too big to be local, and they're too small to be global. And the granularity of countries is kind of exactly the wrong size. In fact, it couldn't be worse. And then we start talking about competitiveness, national competitiveness, and that actually is revolting. That really is obscene, because we are going to worry about competitiveness. In Massachusetts, we're not going to worry about Connecticut, and we're actually not even going to worry about California. But you just go a little further and you cross some boundary, and suddenly what does it mean to compete, even on physical things like growing tomatoes, and it's not just intellectual. So I think that probably the least obvious example of what comes from the world of atoms is countries. And I don't know how to get rid of them, because the global organization, and I've got to be a little careful here, but you know, the United Nations, the World Bank, organizations like that are near useless, partly because of their own operations, but something like the World Bank is based on countries. Countries are donors and recipients and make requests. And again, it's all, if you build a road in Africa that goes from north to south through 9 countries, you're dealing with 9 different divisions in the bank or in the United Nations. There's no concept of really road or concept of education. And languages fall out of that. Languages, people are constantly saying to me, well, how can you give an X prize to learn how to read and write English around the world? Well, the answer is real simple. And it's not the new colonialism. The answer is it's the new globalism, and that any head of state whom you ask will ask that their kids learn English at least as a second language, and in quite a few countries it's the first language even though it's not spoken in the villages. You go to a country like Sierra Leone and the kids in first grade learn how to read and write English even though it's not spoken in the village. And so this is not something that I invented or that it's happening just because of the tablet experiment. It's something that is, in fact, happening. Now, project out. If it's 10,000 years, it's easy. First of all, there'll be nobody to collect the bets, but it's easy to bet on there being one language. People, you know, sometimes, well, maybe there'll be two, maybe Chinese and English, or Chinese and the Latin alphabet won't merge, but I think they will. And it's certainly, if you've got 10,000 years, they will merge. So, you know, will we speak one language? Yes. Will we write one language and read? Yeah, I think so. So that's sort of perhaps the extreme. And I think I have, no, this is that was my last slide, so that may be a hint. Oh, I guess this is actually cute in the sense that it was my first slide on the screen. I found this, see, this is a postcard that was made in France in, I think, 1917 as to what education would be in the year 2000. And I thought that was an extraordinary image. And there's a piece of me that wants to do that because I was dyslexic, still am, and reading is a challenge. But then my wife, who founded and runs the Boston Book Festival, see, clearly I'm compensating, she gets the New York Review of Books. And I don't know how many of you look at that regularly or once in a blue moon. The books that are advertised have these they all have extraordinary covers. Cover design in the book world has skyrocketed. Books really have, in general, very, very nice covers. And so I look at the books in in the New York Review of Books that are advertised on the various pages, the various presses, and I'm just awestruck by how good they are. But of course, in the process, I read the title, and I say, "Wow, I'd like to read that book." And I look at them, and I say, "Boy, in one issue, there are about 500 books that I would love to read," or maybe not that many, maybe it's 200, but it's a lot of books, and you know, maybe this is the way to do it, is to sort of get it out. So I think, Stewart, we're on, if wherever you're sitting. Yeah. I don't know if I came in on time or off time, but if it's too short, we'll make up for it in questions. Thank you very much.
You glided by something fundamental, Hepsi.
Okay. Only one?
Well, so much seemed to rotate on it. I want to be sure what was there. It sounded like it was constructionism versus instructionism or something like that.
Yeah.
Unpack a little.
Any learning by discovery fits constructionism, but the more pure people would argue that it includes making. You can't just discover without making something. Mm-hmm. So that world is maybe simply stated as the learning by doing. The instructionist world is learning by being told, and whether it's told this way or being told by reading or some other, so-called multimedia experience, that's the instructionism side. And I'm always fascinated by the fact that knowing and learning are kind of confused, and that because our system tests you on what you know, mm-hmm. not on your ability to learn, it's flawed. It's a faulty system.
Can you test for ability to learn or for acquired ability to learn?
I think the test for the ability to learn is generally considered the ability to be a creative mind and a creative, to look at problems differently, to basically see things, Marvin would always say this, from more than one point of view. And that's, a very good test. Rote learning, and I'm being very sort of simplistic here, is the easiest, and I think it's pretty deadly. There are actually people who think that the Chinese and the Koreans have a better education system. And it's mind-boggling. It's just stunning.
Who has a better education system from your standpoint?
The well-known one, the country that gets credit all the time, is Finland. And Scandinavian countries in general get a pretty good. But the problem with education in this country is in some sense separate from the institution of schools. It's a lot of other things that are happening, and the fact that it's age segregated, that it's run on real estate taxes by and large, and this test stuff, teaching to tests. My God, we pay teachers in accordance to test results.
You would pay them in accordance with what? How would you know the right thing is happening?
I certainly wouldn't do it by test scores.
What you do with one laptops is basically you track, you watch their little fingers at work.
Yeah. I would spend time with the kids. One of the things that is so clear when you go into a classroom and you meet a few children, you don't have to test them. You know pretty quickly what's going on. And I was fascinated in there are about 3 million, a little less than 3 million laptops out there now, our laptops. And one of the most surprising results is how much teachers like them. And everybody thought teachers would hate them, and teachers often don't like them until they get them.
I remember when that happened with pocket calculators back when. Remember those days? Mustn't let the pocket calculator in the math class, it's cheating.
And it was considered cheating.
Yeah, and then the teachers discovered actually it made math easy instead of impossible. And enjoyable instead of a big pain. So Alexander Rose has a version of, Kevin says there's 7 versions to this question. Khan Academy is misguided. Can you elaborate on a more useful way to do online education?
Well, Khan Academy's problem is the age group. And even Khan Academy skews upward and thinks in terms of middle school and high school. And arguably, the instructionist approach makes more and more sense as you get older and older. You could argue that's where it is. It's not in the first 5 or 6 years of school. We all remember great teachers in our lives, great teachers when we were young, but they were great not because they knew a subject. You didn't like your history teacher because he or she knew history. They knew you, and they got you excited, and they got the class excited, and it wasn't about the transmission of a body of knowledge you need to test. It was your creativity and energy that was being amplified by somebody who got you interested. So the first part is the first few years, just like the first 5 years before you even go to school. It's not so much the acquisition of bodies of knowledge. It's more the acquisition of the ability to acquire the stuff.
Now, part of the Khan Academy theory, or anyway, the practice that emerged, is that the teachers, instead of, quote, instructing, basically lecturing passive kids, that sort of happens at home on the computer, and what the teachers are now doing is kind of helping the kids, and the kids helping each other with, quote, homework, which does sound like your kind of thing.
Very much. Khan Academy has done 2 things splendidly. One, it's a nonprofit, which I think is really something very important and people don't keep in mind enough. The second is that they participated in, they didn't invent, but they participated in so-called flipping the classroom, where you do stuff, which is what you're talking about. But then there are three things that are so wrong, it kind of annihilates the first two. One, and I've talked to Saul about this, he seems to think that he and a small number of people can make all the material. That's changing a little bit, but hello? That doesn't make sense. The second is that the minimalism of graphics is not to be confused with low production values. Okay, I'm very happy to have minimalist graphics, but it's low production values that he's actually got. And the third thing, and this, I don't know why we're ranting on Saul, but the third thing, which is the worst, is there's this belief you can become a quick study and read a book on Chile after the Allende government and then do a program on it, or a program on communism. He happens to know about algebra, so that worked. Okay, and then, Bill Gates and others picked up on it, but, then doing something on a subject, it's not that it's hard versus soft, it's a subject that, there are people who've spent their lives maybe not studying Chile after the Allende government, but studying communism or a subject like that. And it's not something you can become a quick study and do an hour. So those three things seem so flagrantly wrong that I'm surprised that it's gotten the traction, but it has, obviously, because flipping the classroom is a very good idea. Plus, he's a splendid person, which is also important.
You've said a couple times now, with kind of a vehemence, that nonprofits are amazing and wonderful, and you put it sort of markets versus mission. Say a little more. Is MIT a nonprofit? I forget.
Yes, of course.
Okay, well.
Yes.
And all of its money comes from
That's interesting.
businesses. And MIT, Stanford and East Coast, West Coast. Frederick Terman learned at MIT how to hook companies to a university and forget the ivory tower and bring in the money and then put out the Hewlett-Packards, and Silicon Valley was invented basically at MIT and then came through Stanford. So that nonprofit works best when it's really pretty well funded by for-profits, it seems like. But it sounds like
Yeah.
I mean,
you're picking one that happens to, you even had to ask if it was a nonprofit. So that,
well, I remember it's a corporation. It makes a big deal about that.
Yeah. I think you have to. Let me phrase it differently. And I wake up in the morning and I ask myself one question: will normal market forces do what I'm doing? And if the answer is yes, then stop doing it. I shouldn't do it.
Bill Gates has been doing that same analysis. Did he get it from you, or you guys converged? Anyway.
But the problem with nonprofits, and I'll talk about big ones, including the Gates Foundation, but just in general, NGOs are so badly run. People say, well, it's got to be a business because then it'll be well run. And if it's not a business, it won't be well run. Well, rubbish. You can be business-like and run a nonprofit very well. And one shouldn't confuse business-like with being a business. Now, the problem with scale, especially the nonprofits who give money, and I'll take the MacArthur Foundation. I'll pick on the MacArthur Foundation. By the way, Jerry Wiesner, who was president of MIT, went to see MacArthur when in Florida. He lived in Florida. And MacArthur said to him, young man, what would you do with $100 million? And Jerry, very foolishly, he didn't do too many foolish things in his life, but this was foolish. He said to MacArthur, let me think about it and get back to you. Okay. And he comes back to MIT and MacArthur dies. Okay. So, big mistake. Big mistake.
I did that once, yeah.
You heard? But he was on the MacArthur board. Now, the MacArthur does this extraordinary genius grants thing, which, whatever it's called, there's a proper name for it.
Fellows.
Whatever. But it's. I think it's kind of interesting. Everybody knows about it. Everybody in the street knows about it. Everybody in this room knows about it. But then they do other things, okay, which you don't know about particularly. And if you do, you're kind of an outlier, and you might have, heard of one or two things. Now, why is that the case? The case is because you have program directors. And program directors have directors and programs, and suddenly you have this whole institution. You've got to give them all a little bit of money to manage, and this gets in there. And finally, you find that the number of program directors, I'm not even saying whether they're good or bad, you just take the number of programmers and divide it into the leftover money. It's like corporate social responsibility, which is a really bad idea. And corporate social responsibility suffers from the same thing. I was on the Motorola board, and we had $300 million in the foundation. And I thought, wow, that's pretty interesting. That can make an impact. No, Motorola was in 170 countries, and each one got a little piece, and then there were 4 divisions. He divided that by 4, and then there were different people, and they all had. And so it was all these little tiny, little $20,000, $30,000 grants, which has no traction, no critical mass, and it just dissipates. And so that's another problem which happens with the big foundations. I believe there are 1,000 professionals at the Gates Foundation.
So you like small nonprofits?
I like big nonprofits with a small number of people.
Now,
Let me ask you a question.
yeah.
In the 6 years of the one laptop per child, how much money was involved over 6 years?
Well, 6 years, that's all? And then it was
Well,
done?
that was the time that I was involved. Say 7 if you want to add a year.
Less than 10 million, more than 4.
Okay. It was $1 billion.
$1 billion.
$1 billion.
I'm off by how many orders?
So, okay. And the reason it was $1 billion is you, first of all, take 3 million and multiply it by an average of 200, you get to 600 million right there. So that was,
You guys who
slipping
studied
on your
math,
math.
just
Yes.
the shortcut.
But the rest it wasn't coming through this little group in Cambridge. You had 150 people working in Uruguay. Okay, on one laptop per child. It was called Plan Cebal.
And they're
You had
famously
150
inexpensive in those places.
But 150 people, still 150 people times their salaries, large or small, times 6 years, times all the other stuff, it added up to $1 billion.
Let me ask you a question about the one laptop, which puzzles me because I run into various forms of it, which is the very public troll behavior that emerged. So you put out one laptop per child, and here's Negroponte, spending years of his life and trying to get education to the world. And a lot of people are going, nah, it won't work, blah, who does he think he is, the wrong theory, wrong tech. What the hell is that all about? What is this troll thing that gets loose?
Well, we won't talk about the parts where they were right. Okay, let's leave that out. Because they're a little piece.
We can.
To me, the most surprising, when I look back and you say, what surprises you the most? What surprises me the most was the degree to which commercial interests would go to sort of sabotage things. I thought I had a Mother Teresa shield around me, and it just isn't so.
They saw it as competition, or what? Or they were cheating by being nonprofit?
Stewart, it's things like, having a beachhead, or that I remember when Hewlett-Packard, when I was a student, Tektronix and Hewlett-Packard, actually it was mostly Tektronix, would give MIT oscilloscopes each year. Thousands of oscilloscopes, gifts of oscilloscopes. And that's because every MIT student, it was Tektronix actually, learned how to use an oscilloscope with a Tektronix oscilloscope. So it was the self-interest and the sort of the beachhead that they got was very important. So it's partly that and a lot of other things. I mean, so I reminded, this is a bad subject because I just came from Boston and we don't know what really created the, who created the bombs or the motive or anything. But one of the things that changed terrorism worldwide was when somebody was willing to give up their life. And so if you strap bombs on yourself and you walk, that's pretty hard.
Suicide bombers were new.
That was a real inflection point. And I remember telling a couple of companies who will remain nameless, I said, I'm not earning a salary, never earned a penny. My career is not dependent on one laptop per child. I don't care what anybody says, so I'm not trying to protect a reputation. I said, I'm like a suicide bomber. There's nothing you can do.
That's great.
Yeah.
And they inspire each other, don't they? There's a lot of copycat suicide bombers out there. Kevin Kelly asks a question. In the new globalism, will diversity increase or will it...
Will what?
Diversity.
Diversity.
Increase or will it converge as language and currency will? I think this is sort of a granularity question. You're saying that nations are wrong size. They're too small to be global and too big to be local. So as some of this stuff goes global, does that mean a whole lot of other stuff goes local?
I guess, let me talk about diversity because one of my favorite examples, and even if you don't, you eliminate racial diversity and you just look at the UK, at England, and it's a country that has this enormous respect, not just tolerance, but respect for idiosyncrasies. Have you ever met a non-idiosyncratic Englishman or Englishwoman?
No, right.
The diversity is
wall to wall, pretty much.
Yeah, but I mean, the diversity in attitudes and so on is kind of pretty high. Even if you look at different parts of the world, I don't think diversity is going to go down in the local sense. I think it'll go up, not down. Now, maybe you'd be better placed to answer this. Maybe genetically we will evolve into a single race and intermarriage and the genes,
Modern Meadow is going to take us the opposite way. We'll be printing all kinds of one-horned and one-eyed flying purple people eaters. And marrying them.
Maybe.
R&R has a question. The new identity is said to be a cohabitation of the real and the virtual, your bits and your atoms. Isn't the real being run out of town by the virtual?
Well, the real isn't being run out of town because that's all you can interact with. You can't it's got to, the virtual has to be transformed into something you can see, touch, eat, whatever. So at least the real has the interface meeting. But I don't think the quality of life is driven a lot by the real, not the virtual. And I think, no, it's not being run out of town.
Let me add to the question. Louis
Yeah.
Rossetto, that was just handed to me by Kevin.
Oh, God, that's dangerous.
Louis says it used to be about atoms becoming bits. This lecture was titled Beyond Digital. Does that mean that bits are becoming atoms? After all, we really do live in the material world. Time for reappraisal of the physical, which it sounds like you're working up on. Yeah.
I had to, it's one of these things where Stewart asks you to speak and then says, what are you going to talk about? And I don't know, and give it a title. I thought Beyond Digital was actually pretty good. And then I said, Jesus, how am I going to live up to that? But I think the physical world is where the quality of life is in many ways. And then the virtual world, the connection part, first of all physical things will be connected to all other physical things. So, are they real? Are they virtual? How much of the behavior of the thing comes from its connectivity? How much is happening in the thing? How much? Those boundaries will start to disappear. But I find, for instance, the connectedness of people rather thrilling. The idea of alone together. Sherry Turkle's beautiful title. I mean, the title is fantastic, and I hope it gets used in the language. But I don't buy into that. I think the being connected is quite extraordinary, and I've found occasion where in the middle of a dinner I actually did send a message or receive a message. And so yes, the caricature of 4 young kids sitting at a table all doing SMS with people not at the table is a caricature, but those of you who remember laser printers when they were first introduced, God, the stuff that came out of those was complete crap. People changed fonts and had big ones and shadow ones and depths and things, and it was a disaster area. It set
I remember you and
graphic-
Alan Kay marveling, oh my God, the world is learning about kerning.
A good thing to learn about, but stick to one font, and preferably without serifs.
Well, by now you probably have a theory of how long it takes to go through that period of junk with the new medium.
It's not clear how long it takes, because there's always people that have to go back through it again, and it's not just that society learns. You find everybody that gets a really large palette of anything is going to start using it at first. It's a little bit like the first time you have a video camera. You're going to keep panning and zooming this thing, and then as you kind of get used to it, you'll sort of realize that it's a medium where you don't just want to keep panning and zooming and changing. You can use it much more astutely.
I remember when one of the MIT students sort of lashed a television camera onto his body and went around living that way, and we all thought that was pretty grotesque. And yet here it comes, that's seemingly the way we'll all be with our glass or whatever.
Yeah, but and you always want the people who are the precursors of it to do that kind of stuff. And if you know anybody doing that kind of stuff, send them to the Media Lab. That's where they should be. We'd really like to be the place where that happens. Now, then whether it rolls out in the same way, look how long it took for it to come to things like the Google glasses and so on. It's taken, a long time, but.
How's Media Lab doing this many years later?
Look, the Media Lab did the most incredible piece of work it's done, at least in a decade, and that is to hire Joey Ito.
Right.
Okay, that was
With no
stroke
academic
of
credentials
genius.
worth mentioning, right? I mean,
Well, the fact that he was Timothy Leary's godson, we left off.
I didn't know that
You
part.
didn't know that piece?
No,
But for those of you who don't know him, at the time, he's 44 years old and Japanese. He's 44 years old and he's a dropout. And I have gone back to the lab, whatever that means. Neither I nor MIT completely know. But one of the things is that I'm involved with hiring new faculty, and I've interviewed lots of faculty candidates, and almost everyone has said that they're interested in the faculty position because of Joey Ito. And if we had the courage in our academic institution to hire a dropout, that was the place they wanted to be. And I thought that's just splendid.
Okay, courage and everything. How's it playing out? What's actually happening in the lab that Joey's enabled?
What's happening is a real shift away from objects to networks. It's happening. It's a real shift into sort of he's much more bottoms up. I was much more top down. Maybe that goes with the suit. He's really much more listening. I think this is an error. He listens to the students. We don't completely agree on that. But why would you ever listen to the students? They're only there for 3 or 4 years, so they, by definition, have a very small view. But the place is different. It's changing. It's changing very, very quickly.
I remember there were going to be imitation media labs all over the place. Has that worked out?
There will never be an imitation. And I'll tell you why. It's not arrogance. And again, it was very much luck. If you look at the constituent parts, what made up the Media Lab in the beginning? I happened to be the academic head at the time of film department, photography, graphic design, computer animation, and even graduate music. So those were sort of already part of the band that was going to be put together. And then I went to the then provost and said, because Seymour Papert was in the DSRE, Division of Study and Research and Education. And I went to the provost and I said, I'd like to include Seymour Papert. And he said, bless your heart. Oh, bless your heart. And you take him off my hands. And I said, we'd like to include Marvin. Ah, and it was a salon des refusés in the real sense. And the MIT did not have an art school, did not have an ed school, did not have a journalism school, did not have, you go down the list. And then every other potential place where it could have existed had some of those parts. So if you tried to do it someplace else, tried to do it at, I don't know, invent Berkeley. I believe there's a journalism school, and you try to do it at USC, and there's a film school, and you try and do it at Harvard, and there's the Carpenter Center, and there's the ed school, and then you try. So the piece that was so magical is that it was frictionless, absolutely frictionless. Nobody. The only friction you got was people thought it was an opportunity cost. But what opportunity cost? We had sort of basically gathered together the refuse and put ourselves in a building. And so arguably the cost of the building could have been put for something else. But that's
bloody expensive building.
At the time, it wasn't so expensive. Whatever, $26 million.
Inspired me to write a book about how terrible it was. Compared to building 20 across the way.
Yeah.
Well, this raises a question, and it bears relation, and there's a lot of Long Now members here who can help us think about this, which has to do with the question of franchising. And we get invitations to, can we do Long Now in Canada? Can we do Long Now in London? Can we do Long Now? And you saw no end of, we would like to do a media lab in Singapore, we would like to do a media lab in Ireland, all these various things.
We did it 5 times or something, 5 failures.
Spell it out. What happened? Why do franchises of these kinds of things fail?
Because for some reason, I'm a slow learner, for some reason you forget how important the culture around you is. Whether it's the risk-taking nature of the United States, whether it's the willingness. I remember when I wrote Lewis will remember there, it was one of my first articles for Wired, was called Why Europe is So Unwired. And it went down the bullets which relate to why, a Media Lab was happening there in Boston, not in Europe. And my father, both my parents were alive, and both of them were sort of hyper-Europeans. I forgot if you met them.
No.
They were
Your brother, but not your parents.
Yeah, hyper-European. I mean, my father spoke 8 languages. If you played Trivial Pursuit with him, he corrected the cards. And the relationship with your parents was, again, in those days, more formal, and mine even slightly more formal. And I had written this Wired story as to why Europe was so unwired. And my father, I was visiting them in Switzerland over Christmas, and he said he didn't like the story because it wasn't correct. And so I said, well, let's discuss it after dinner. I figured we wouldn't try and do it at dinner, and let's go down the points. And the first one was about centralism. And he said, oh, we're really decentralists, and you don't argue with your father. So I go to the next point. The next point was risk capital and risk taking and so on. He said, oh no, we do that. And of course, so every single point, he had an answer as to why it wasn't true, and I wasn't, again, going to argue until we got to the last one. And it's true, you can go find it. The last one was, Europe doesn't listen to its young. And he looks at me and in all honesty says, why should we?
You said something similar about
so we both laughed
just now, right?
At that point.
There's a lot of people who try to imitate or have a sort of localized Wikipedia, and they all fail. I'm beginning to think that it's more than just that these things don't franchise because they are only really native to the place where they grow, but that there's something about copying that is, remember Xerox copies were always, unlike digital copies, were always not as good as the original, not as good as the original. You get a couple copies out and it's barely readable. And it feels like there's something like that going on. And so the way that Long now we're trying to think about this is,
well, there's some things that get better when they're not authentic, like Greek food. Okay?
and notice the difference. The Greeks don't run what happens to Greek food. What happens is that people elsewhere steal the idea of Greek food and then improve on it. Yeah. So this is my theory of franchising. It doesn't work if there's permission. It only works if it's stolen.
That's good. That's nice. That's nice. Yeah.
Uh-oh.
I like that.
Yeah.
That's good.
Now, how do you encourage theft? I guess probably by really fighting it. Don't you dare steal this stuff. It's copyright.
The best way is
trademark.
Put a lock
trouble
on it.
now, boy.
Put a lock on it.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
Okay. Coming down to the final lap here, Bruce Miller asks, how do self-educating villages, the future of the dismal future of nationalism, and 3D printing come together in the long now? Extrapolate a little farther here.
How do they come together?
Or fan out. I think you went out 100 years that nationalism is going to be no nations, one language.
The one language might be more than 100 years, but God, 100 years, it's just when you think back what's happened, and it's going faster and faster. And exponentials are just always mind-boggling, and we seem to be on so many exponentials.
So are you going to put singularity blindness on this conversation now?
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
The event horizon, we can't think beyond the event horizon. It's only 20 years off. So.
Yeah, no, it's not 20. But, I have a hard time going beyond 2000. It's a little, it's, where do they come together? I guess when you can't tell, that's probably when they come together. You can't tell the difference.
The blend, you mean?
Yeah, then they just are.
Well, you sort of said that. You had those four things. You said these are all going to be aspects of one thing.
Yeah, I think that's probably, the answer is that you won't notice, you won't be able to tell the difference.
Okay, so one more trip back to the run-up that you took. You've been right about so many things. What have you noticed and enjoyed being wrong about? And the second part of that question is, what have you hated being wrong about?
Wow, what interesting questions. I was really wrong about how fast speech would arrive. That I just even wrote about the fact we'd all be talking to things because they were too small to deal with otherwise, and I just imagined a lot more of it, and it's only starting to happen pretty recently. So I was always fond of telling people that I'm always right. I just get the timing wrong.
Right.
Yeah, I got the timing so wrong in that case that I might as well have been wrong.
Well, this is the Sappho's mistaking a clear view for a short distance.
Yeah. What am I annoyed about being wrong? That's interesting. I might have to think about that longer than I want, because the things that I look back, for example, as recently as one laptop per child, I probably shouldn't have done battle with Intel. And I look back at that and think that that was probably a mistake. And it annoys me, because I remember the actual evening that it happened, and I was so pissed off, and you shouldn't be pissed off. So that's annoyed me, sort of a little bit.
Was that something that?
But that's not a prediction.
Wasted
That's
time
not a big
fighting
thing.
rather than just going around, or what?
It's because you do something because you think it's a principle, and you're not. You realize that the gratification you get in being principled actually screws a lot of other people, and that's probably the most frustrating kind of thing.
So this must be a downside to the nonprofit mission-oriented.
Yeah, it certainly could be a downside, and again, the mission versus market is you can use them either way. It can be a downside, bigger downside to a business. I mean, I've seen a lot of people who have screwed up their own businesses by being stubborn or,
And then they go away. The seeming advantage of nonprofits versus businesses, and I'm nonprofit most of my life, and Ryan is mostly business, and this is a conversation in the family. But a business goes out of business when it screws up or is unlucky. A nonprofit has a harder time knowing when things aren't going right, because it's all song and dance anyway. And you can just keep playing your music and nobody's dancing, but it doesn't matter.
Well,
I guess it doesn't matter. They don't do any harm.
Well, let me invert it and talk a little bit about profits and profit making, startups in particular. Because Joey Ito and I argue a little bit about that, and I say, all these startups are sucking the people out of big thinking. That you get so many minds that used to think big are now thinking small because they're doing these startups, and their venture funding tells them, and this is, God, I hate the word, focus, focus, and become cash flow positive, which is a really stupid idea in a startup. It's truly stupid. If you have a startup, you don't want to be cash flow positive. You want to come to a precipice and get more, build up the value and keep the risk high. So I was just at dinner with this Modern Meadows guy.
Which one?
It was I forget his name now, I'm blocking
right,
his name, but the young man who's the CEO of it. And Vinod Kushla was sitting beside him, and I was sitting beside Vinod.
Interesting.
And Vinod was giving him advice on how to start Modern Meadows. And I listened to Vinod, all the things, very carefully listened, and I finally said, Vinod, every single thing you have just told him is the exact opposite of what I would have told him.
Good.
Okay, exact opposite.
Examples?
Examples. Do leather before meat.
Right.
Become cash flow positive. Get rid of your risk. So on. Say, huh? Why would you do that? Don't screw around with leather. Do meat, and do meat fast, and feed the world, and keep the risk high, and get as much money in as fast as possible. In other words, and I'm not saying my advice was the exact opposite. And I don't know. Maybe I think that the startup mentality, and there's some extraordinary exceptions. A startup, which I think is a big exception, is Kickstarter. I thought, wow, that's actually a big idea, and was done rather well in the startup mode.
Sort of a meta startup.
Yeah, it was pretty extraordinary, and I like that when you can find it, but it's pretty rare.
So it sounds like you're not saying, Vinod is saying focus, start with leather, and it's easy, and nobody complains about it. And so I can sort of hear his arguments. In fact, I think I made a version of it. And you're saying something different. You're not saying blur as the opposite of focus. You're saying be more insanely ambitious.
Yeah, okay, that's the opposite of focus. Yeah, yeah.
Go large early. Go weird early. Go to the strangest aspect of what you're attempting early, rather than holding that for some kind of, once you've made all the money, then you get to be strange. What are you saying?
No, what I'm saying is be bold versus timid, and as far as you can, if you really say, well, these really two important markets and options, and somebody say, well, pick one. Maybe not. Maybe you do two. Maybe you do three. In other words, don't focus as such is not always a virtue. So it's not blur. It's more about boldness and
Famously, startups and VCs and all that, long now, short now, they drive for a very short now. Get big fast, niche in the market. There's a going for something tiny and masterable in very rapid fashion. Is part of your worry that people who act that way will wind up being only able to act that way and not think large and long and deep and strange?
I guess what I'm saying is that if you look at the world energy that's coming from, maybe you can think of it demographically, however you want to think about it, the number of people that in some sense did what you and I did, and we did it in different ways, but we sort of did the same thing. And that's happening less and less because there's a lot of air is being sucked into the world of startups and the world of so-called entrepreneurship. and innovation in ways that ignore the fact that market forces don't do everything. And this is totally against the stream, and I'm not suggesting for a moment that we should all revert to government-funded research and everybody be part of a university at all. But there is a smallness of thinking that has evolved that I just hadn't seen before, just generally.
Well, the thing that impresses me about Google is that it is, grad school at Stanford writ large, and that they still work that way and live that way, and it is absolutely a university byproduct.
It's extraordinary, but first of all, it's a wild exception, and it's got two people who are deep down techies, and it's kept its character because of that. I don't see Facebook doing that.
Well, it's undergraduate, not graduate school.
That's pretty
Let's call
good.
it a night.
That's a good line.
Thank you for coming.
That's very good.